Hello, good evening everyone. I will make a reaction video. Okay, before I check the video, I will introduce myself. My name is Francisca de Flora Bihang. Please call me Devi. Okay, we going to watching this video. Wait.
I grew up moving all over the place. By the time I hit 10th grade, I'd lived in 10 different places. Math is extraordinarily sequential. And by the time I'd hit 3rd grade, I'd fallen off the math bandwagon. Basically, I flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science. So it's a little strange looking back now because today I'm a professor of engineering and I'm passionate about my job. One day, one of my students found out about my past and he asked me, "How did you do it? How did you change your brain?" And I thought, how did I do it? I mean,
Okay, this woman is named Dr. Barbara Oakley. Okay, here is she want to tell her experience where when she was still in the school. Okay, watching again.
loved language and culture, and that's all I wanted to learn when I grew up. But I didn't have the money to go to college, so I enlisted in the Army right out of high school to learn a language. And you can see me there looking very nervous, about to throw up. And I grew up
Sorry.
moving all over the place. So I enlisted in the Army right out of, here I was, this little kid, and I just loved. One day, one of my students found out about my past, and he asked me, "How did you do it? How did you change your brain?" And I thought, how did I do it? Here I was, this little kid, and I just loved language and culture, and that's all I wanted to learn when I grew up. But I didn't have the money to go to college, so I enlisted in the Army right out of high school.
Wow, this little boy asked you this woman, how do you eat? And how do you change your brain? Interesting question, guys. Okay, next.
But I began to realize something, though. I was doing all these adventures and seeing these new perspectives, but somehow they were always external. They weren't internal. I wasn't changing inside. When I'd worked in the military, I'd worked with all these West Point engineers, and they had these powerful techniques for problem solving. And I thought, I'd look sometimes at what they were doing, and they had these calculus and physics books, and it looked like hieroglyphics to me. But I thought, what if I could get those ideas? What if I could learn that?
Okay, guys, this moment is Army out high school to learn language. Wow, this call is struggle, guys. Every vice there must be way. Okay, next.
And technology are important too. What if I could learn these new ideas and add them to the ideas I already knew and loved? So when I got out of the military at age 26, I decided to try and change my brain. It wasn't easy. But if I knew then what I know now about how to learn, I could have learned much more easily and much more effectively. So several years ago, as I began trying to answer that student's question, how did I change my brain? I began reaching out to top professors from around the world, people who not only had knowledge of their difficult areas of expertise, but also who could teach effectively. And I asked them, I said, "How did you learn? And how do you teach so others can learn?" And what I found was The way they learned and the way they taught was often similar to the way I learned and I taught. It was almost like this kind of shared fraternal handshake. But we often didn't know why we did what we did. So I began researching neuroscience and cognitive psychology and reaching out into talk to top experts in those fields. And here is what I found: the keys to learning effectively. Now, as we know, the brain is enormously complex, but we can simplify its operation into two fundamentally different modes.
Wow, the extraordinary experience for this great woman, and really inspired for students and to have a high enthusiasm for learning.
First is what I'll call the focus mode. And the focus mode is just like it sounds like. You turn your attention to something and boom, it's on. But the second mode is a little different. It's a relaxed set of neural states that I'll call the diffuse mode. It's a number of resting states. And so it seems that when you're learning, you're going back and forth between these two different modes. Now, how can we better understand these modes? Through analogy. And what we're going to use is a pinball machine analogy. And you all know how pinballs work. You just pull back on the plunger and the ball goes boinking out and bounces around on the rubber bumpers, and that's how you get points. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this pinball and we're going to put it right on your brain, right? So there it is. There's the pinball machine on your brain. And if you look, this is the analogy for the focus mode. And when you're learning, you're often thinking tightly as you're focusing on something. It involves thoughts you're somewhat familiar with, perhaps historical patterns, or you're familiar with the multiplication table. So you think a thought and it takes off and moves along smoothly, pretty much along the pathways that you've already laid. But what if the thought you're thinking is actually a new thought, a new concept, a new technique that you've never thought of before? Well, that's symbolized by this new pattern towards the bottom of the pinball machine metaphor. To get to this new place, I mean, at least sort of metaphorically speaking, look at all the rubber bumpers that are in the way. How can you even get there? You need a different way of thinking, a new perspective, in a sense. And that's provided here by the diffuse mode. Look at how far apart those rubber bumpers are from one another. When you think a thought, it takes off and it can range very widely as you're attempting to come up with some new ideas. So you can't do the careful focus thinking that you can in the focus mode, but you can at least get to the place you need to be in to grapple with these new ideas. So the bottom line for all of us out of this is this: when you're learning, you want to go back and forth between these modes. And if you find yourself as you're focusing...
Guys, apparently this woman is great. She can teach effectively to her student. Okay, the first she said that are two modes of thinking, namely focus mode and diffuse mode. Okay, the first focus mode is means that we are consecrating, devoting focus and attention to learn. And to the second, discuss most when we are relaxation and not thinking about anything, and the intention is to help us to see the general picture and connect the ideas we have learned before.
in on something, trying to learn a new concept or solve a problem, and you get stuck. You want to turn your attention away from that problem and allow the diffuse modes, those resting states, to do their work in the background. Now, how can we actually use these ideas in real life? If you look at this guy right here, he was Salvador Dali. one of the most brilliant surrealist painters of the 20th century. Dali was the very definition of a wild and crazy guy. You can see him there. He's got his pet ocelot, Babu. And what Dali used to do when he was kind of stuck as he was solving some problem related to his painting was he'd sit down and he'd relax in a chair and he'd have keys in his hands. And he'd hold those keys and he'd relax and kind of let his brain noodling away. And just as he'd relax so much that he'd fall asleep, the keys would fall from his hands, the clatter would wake him up, and off he'd go. He'd take those ideas from the diffuse mode over to the focus mode, where he could work with them, refine them, and use them for his painting. So you might think, well, that's great. That's good for an artist. But I'm an engineer. So how can I use these ideas? Well, if you see this guy right here, he was Thomas Edison, one of the most brilliant inventors in history. And what Edison used to like to do, at least according to legend.
Well, guys, I will summarize the chat from Dr. Barbara Oakley. This is because the video of her speech takes 70 minutes. Also, in learning, the ideas is combination of focus mode and discuss mode. The first, procrastination, means the procrastinate